Hey worship team, this is just a catch-up video on what you missed out in the All-In night. And I'm going to be sharing with you something that God has been speaking to me about and what He wants me to impart into the worship team. So God's been talking to me about Acts chapter 16, which talks about Paul and Silas. Now this is after Jesus has risen from the dead, and Paul and Silas are going through Rome and they're preaching that people can get saved, they can get set free. But there's this particular woman, and she is known as a fortune teller. And it says in the word that she is demon possessed. Alright, Paul turns around and rebukes her and rebukes the demon, and it comes out, and her employers see this, that demon possessed skill that she had to predict the future, it was gone, so they're going to lose all their business. So what they do is they go tell the Roman authorities, and it says in chapter 16 verse 20, it says, "They brought them before the magistrates and said, 'These men are Jews and throwing our city into an uproar by advocating customs unlawful for us, Romans, to accept or practice.'" And it says in verse 22, "The crowd joined in against the attack against Paul and Silas, and the magistrates ordered them to be stripped and beaten with rods. After they had been severely flogged, they were thrown into prison, and the jailer was commanded to guard them carefully." And that's insane for doing God's work. They were thrown into jail, and if you read on further in chapter 16, it says that once they were thrown into jail, that Paul and Silas prayed to God. They sung songs, they praised God. And it says also a bit further on that the jail cell, the chains were broken, that the doors were opened, and God set them free from that jail. And you can continue reading on with that story, what happened. But putting in the context of a waiting room, what do you think of a waiting room? Do you think of its dread? Do you think it's not a very nice place? It's frustrating when you go to the doctors and the doctor's running late. It's frustrating. But when we talk about waiting on God, when we seem to get thrown into that jail cell, into that waiting room, it's not meant to be frustrating when we wait on God. Example with the calling. He may tell you that you're called for this ministry, but there's not enough people in there. There's not enough leadership team to actually do the ministry. God may have said to you, "I want you to own your own house," but you haven't got the promotion to actually get that money to buy that house. And sometimes when we wait on God, that waiting room may seem pointless or even painful room, but sometimes most of the time, what God sees as your waiting room can be His most productive room. We can turn our waiting room into a working room. And just as Paul and Silas did, they didn't just wait in the jail cell, they immediately got to it and started praising God and singing hymns to God. They didn't just wait for the miracle to happen. Right? So what I'm believing for in my workroom is that there is revival coming to Taree. And you know revival is coming because you've heard Pastor Wayne say it, you've heard other preachers come here and say it, and it's going to be amazing. But we can't do it by just waiting, by just sitting here. Sure, God can do anything and everything He wants, but He can't work with people who are complacent and who are just sitting here. So what do? How do we turn our waiting room into a working room? As you know, one of the famous stories in the Bible about the Sermon on the Mount, how Jesus has a crowd, it says, of 4,000 men, and it says that from those 4,000 men, there's roughly about 4 people in each family, and it roughly adds up to about 20,000 people. So Jesus is going to preach to 20,000 people. So He turns to His disciples and He's like, "Man, look, we've got to feed these people before I preach to them. Go find me some food to feed these people." And the disciples are like, "What? You know, it's too late in the day to go to the local store and buy food." And Jesus, like as if they're expecting Jesus to have this miraculous sign of bread rain down from heaven. But the thing is, what Jesus does, this boy gives him 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, and breaks it up in between the disciples, and they're like, "Hey, look, I know this is going to feed, only a few people, but feed 20,000 people with it." And the disciples are like, "Yeah, okay, we'll do that." For some crazy reason, that bread, that fish was broken. It fed 20,000 people. And the principle of the story is that God has given us only a little bit with our worship team. God may only give you a little bit of finance to buy the house. It's just not enough. But what God is saying is, look, you need to step out with what you have. I don't care if you have $100,000, $200,000. He says, use what you have and I'll bless it exceedingly. How can only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish feed 20,000 people? The thing is, with stepping out, one thing we get wrong sometimes is we think it starts with church life, but that's not the concept that we should be living by. It starts at home. It starts whether you read your word, whether you pray to God. And once we start stepping out with what we have, and this is when we will see revival.